Okay, I got this phone so I can see comments. Anybody got a conversation topic they want me to touch on? Steve Blake says, all I can think of is watermelon. Is it hot where you are, Steve? Of course it's hot where I'm at. It's always hot where I live. Look at this sweet girl. She likes watermelon too. You want some? Now, is that a country dog or what? You sweet girl. Okay, let's see if I can get this settled. If anybody wants to discuss something, preferably banjo related, history related, I'd love to sit here and chat with you on my little lunch break. If I can get this open. Got too much watermelon in my hand. I'll just sit here and eat the watermelon if y'all don't have a question or a prompt. That's a pretty cool banjo right here. Check out the grooves in that fingerboard. Whee! Somebody played the hell out of this, huh? This is pretty neat. It is for sale if anybody wants it. Make a great wall hanger for somebody. Okay. Okay, now I see some comments. So Jeff says he watches us from Cape Cod. That's cool. I have never been that far north, I don't believe. I've certainly never been to Cape Cod. I've seen a Cape Cod house. Evan Collins. How you doing, Evans? You in Ohio, right? Evan and I have never met, I don't think. But I do like your music, sir, and your other artistic contributions. Jeff says howdy from West Virginia. Charleston, West Virginia. I've never been there either. I've only been to West Virginia to go to Clifftop. About 10 or more years ago. Ah. So Evan's asking me about 1700s banjo player in eastern Kentucky in the late 1700s. Well, Evan, that's not from any census information that I know of. It's a flawed. It's not the most perfect evidence, of course. What it is, it's a memoir that was written in the 19th century by a man who grew up in eastern Kentucky in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. I forget the details of this, but George Gibson writes about it a lot. If you get the book Banjo Roots and Branches, in George's article in the back, the title of the article is Black Banjo Fiddle and Dance in Kentucky and the Amalgamation of African American and Anglo-American Folk Music. If you read that article, he does mention this guy's name was Old Leatherstocking Rector. They called him Mr. Rector, or they called him Old Leatherstocking. We don't know his first name. But he lived in eastern Kentucky in the 1700s. And by about 1790, according to this memoir by another person, old Leatherstocking was making banjo strings out of deer gut. So that's just very fascinating. We already knew the banjo was in eastern Kentucky at least as early as 1781. There's another pretty good account of a wagon train, and they're carrying their enslaved people with them from Virginia into eastern Kentucky. And when they get up to the top of the Blue Ridge, the women and children start crying because they see all those. If you ever been to the mountains, when you get to the top of the mountain for the first time, you look out in the distance and you see all those rippling blue mountains out in the distance for as far as you can see. And if you've never seen anything like it before, it's kind of a devastating sight, especially if you're on a wagon and maybe you're afraid of getting killed or what's going to happen this winter. Pretty scary sight. So long story short, when they got to the top of the Blue Ridge and the women and kids start crying because they see all these mountains in the distance, they went and got one of their slaves who was a banjo picker, and they made him play the banjo to cheer everybody up. And it made him go on. And in the account, it says that all the slaves started in singing with that lone banjo player, which that is very fascinating to me, that he started striking up either a ballad or a work song, for lack of a better term, that all of the enslaved people in the wagon train knew in 1781. And so all these people were singing along with the lone banjo player as they walked up the mountain. It's a beautiful quote. I see Mr. Joel Hooks and Mr. Jeff Menzies just joined us. Ooh. Ah, shit. So what Evans is talking about, Evan is not asking about that. He's asking about old Leatherstocking Rector. So that was in the 1790s with Leatherstocking Rector. And it's fascinating for a number of reasons. It's probably the earliest account of anybody using white-tailed deer to make musical instrument strings of any kind, especially banjo strings. That's pretty cool. And also, we have to get into race a little bit, unfortunately. So, old Leatherstocking, he probably identified as white. Most likely, he was white, identified as white. Because the author of the memoir in the 19th century, he's writing about old Leatherstocking, and we know from other passages in the memoir that this author always points out, if somebody is African American, he always describes that person as a Negro, always, in the rest of the book, which would have been common. And so when he's describing old Leatherstocking, he doesn't mention that he's a quote, Negro. He just says, and he actually calls him Mr. Rector. So it's pretty obvious that old Leatherstocking at least identified as white. And if that's the case, not that I give a damn, but if that's the case, that would make old Leatherstocking the earliest documented white banjo player. Because if he was making banjo strings, what was he making them for? He played the fucking thing. People argue with me for days about that quote. It's common sense. We can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was a banjo picker or what race, ethnicity he identified as. I don't care, because I know in my mind, it's obvious, if that quote is true, which I think it probably is, and that means we probably had banjo players in southern Appalachia as early as 1790 who identified as white. The whole reason that I'm fascinated by it is it's like a slap in the face to this bullshit Minstrel First theory, we call it. Is that they say that the minstrels were the first people to champion the banjo, to pick it up and develop it into a real instrument, bring it to the public. It was already in the public before 1800. And the first minstrel didn't burn cork on his face and pick up a banjo until 1830. This is 30, 40 years later. We also know that the banjo, not even in the mountains, I mean, just all across from Maryland up to New York City, by 1740, everybody knew what a banjo was. It was a very common folk instrument already, and we know that because there's numerous accounts of runaway slaves. You know, you all have all heard about the runaway slave advertisements where they mentioned that the enslaved person was a banjo player or fiddler, this, that, and the other. There are so many accounts of enslaved banjo players in the 1700s, I think they really start to kick off in the 1740s. And by 1740, in these newspaper accounts, it just says, you know, this escaped slave is known to be a banjo player, may be carrying a banjo with him, or plays well on the banjo. There are no descriptions of what a banjo is. So by 1740, everybody who's reading this newspaper, and whether they're in Maryland or Virginia or New York or Pennsylvania, any of these places in the Carolinas, by 1740 they already know what a banjo is. There's no need to describe it. That's a further indicator that it was a very common folk instrument by 1740. That's a full 100 years before Sweeney and them boys got famous. Anyhow, anybody got something else they want to talk about? I'll talk about that all day. Let's see here. Well, here we go, coming up on another question here. Sorry for the delay. Let's see here. So Douglas asks, says he's planning to learn, I'm planning to learn some English folk songs on banjo. What's the best way to work out the best tuning to use? Is it based on the key or a matter of trying a few to see which fits best? Yeah, it's trial and error. It seems like most of the old English folk songs that I know, like Pretty Polly, Silver Dagger, others, a lot of them are in that what they call the G minor tuning, G, D, G, C, D. So that's kind of probably the go-to. Most people who are picking five-string banjo and singing old English folk song over to ballad or whatever, excuse me, most of them are probably tuning their banjo to G, D, G, C, D. The cuckoo. Cuckoo is another great example. A great young banjo player over in Scotland, a guy named Sam Shackleton. They just uploaded a video of him singing Cuckoo Bird on a five-string banjo over in Scotland, I believe. That's on that YouTube channel called Gems on VHS. Gems on VHS. If you look up Sam Shackleton and Cuckoo Bird, and, you know, as far as I know, that boy's dyed-in-the-wool British guy, you know. And I believe I'm sure that banjo's tuned G, D, G, C, D. So now that's not to say that that's the only tuning you can use for English songs, obviously. Like I play Boots and Leggings, which is an old English song in double C, G, D, G, C, D. I play The Devil's Song, that great song. They also call it The Farmer and the Curse, the Farmer's Cursed Wife, or The Devil and the Farmer's Wife. I just call it The Devil's Song. Learned it from Bobby McMillan up in North Carolina. I play that in G, D, G, or G, C, G, C, D, double C. There's a great English cante-fable, very rare song, cante-fable called Little Gold Fiddle. You can look up Little Gold Fiddle in either George Gibson's name or my name, and you can see George's performance and you can see my performance. I learned it from George. George learned that cante-fable from his father, and it is exceedingly rare. And it's documented. We found a broadside of the original ballad that the cante-fable comes from. It's the same story, dated 1707. 1707. So George Gibson's father, in about 1949, 1950, sang him this cante-fable from the early 1700s, which is pretty remarkable. And it's not found anywhere else. The only other place that fable is found, George found it in a 1946 Journal of Folk Music out of Indiana. And that's the only other American reference that I have found to it, that I think he has found either. You have to go back across the ocean to find that. It's pretty remarkable. But that's played out of double C, G, C, G, C, D. And still more, I mean, like Will the Weaver, that's a great, funny, sort of comical ballad, a cuckold kind of joke ballad. I think that you could play that out of G, D, G, B, D, standard tuning. William Hall, another great English style ballad. And we don't know, William Hall is a rare ballad. We don't know if that actually come from England or if it come from America, but if it is, it's probably an American ballad, an early American ballad in the English style. William Hall. It's a rare ballad. That's in standard tuning, the way that I learned it from George. So it is a matter of trial and error, but Doug, if you want to start singing most of those English folk songs on the banjo, most of them are going to probably do pretty well out of G, D, G, C, D. Let's see if anybody else has said anything. Man, Facebook is a pain, isn't it? I don't like messing with her. Let's see here. Oh, Dwight Hawkins just come in here. Hey, Dwight, how you doing? Dwight and I have never met, I don't think, but I like your music, Dwight. Oh, Jake Book is in here. Hey, Jake. Jim Morris. Hey, Jim, how you doing? Jake Book is a great folk musician up in northern Kentucky. Y'all should check him out. Jim Morris is another great musician and a luthier. And I actually use your bridges, Jim. Those the bridges that are copied off the Cole bridge. Looks like an actual bridge. Those are good bridges. I use the 5/8 one. The 3/4 inch ones are a little bit too tall for me. Charles says, don't swallow them watermelon seeds. You'll get pregnant. Oh, boy. Oh, Adam has an interesting question. He says, hey, Cliff, what is your thoughts on switching right-hand techniques, let's say from two-finger to overhand, within a tune in mid-song? He asks, was this a traditional practice? Adam, I don't know that. I don't know that, and I don't know where I saw that first. I want to say that was just something that, in my playing, I want to say that's just something that I started doing without any outside, inspiration. But I could be wrong, because it's something I started doing early on. I'm not sure if I've ever seen George Gibson do that, switch from two. Yes, that is something that I got from George. Yeah, because it was something that I think I was experimenting with, two-finger picking and then going into overhand, or vice versa. It was something I was experimenting with, but I don't think I ever would have had the guts to do that on stage or in a recording until I saw George Gibson do it on stage. George Gibson. I'm sorry I keep saying the man's name so much, but a good chunk of what I know came from that man. But I did see George on stage one time, and I've seen him do it several times with this song. When George plays Darling Cora in GCGCC, he almost always starts out two-finger picking. And then he says that he likes to start out two-finger picking to give the audience a flavor for the song. He thinks it's easier for the audience to get into the tune and to be able to pick it up if you finger pick it first. And then once he starts singing the verses, he starts overhand picking. And George has told me, I don't know if he still feels this way, but he thinks that overhand is a better accompaniment to singing than two-finger. I don't know if he still feels that way. But he says that he's considered trying to call his style of overhand banjo the singing style, because you almost always only sing with it. It's fascinating stuff, getting off subject there, but so you ask if that's a traditional technique to switch from two-finger into overhand. I don't know when they started doing it, but we could probably say yes. When it comes to most of these things, if George Gibson or me or you can think of it today or last year, then, you know, our ancestors have been playing these instruments for more than 200 years. So, yeah, everything was done. Everything was done. They've already played it every way you could possibly play it. I'm sure there was a Scruggs picker somewhere before Scruggs was even born, you know. But now that's getting controversial, I'm sure. So was it a traditional technique? I don't know. But probably was. Oh, my cousin Margaret is on here. Hey, Margaret. So I'm sorry if I've missed some of these questions, y'all. And I'm going as fast as I can. So Daniel says, hey, Clifton, how did you originally meet George Gibson? Seems like such a genuine treasure of a teacher to meet so young. Also, what's next for the Permaculture Appalachia project? Really been enjoying the content over there. So Daniel's talking about a couple things. The one thing he's talking about there is my other YouTube channel. Y'all are probably familiar with my main YouTube channel, which is just my name, Clifton Hicks. We operate a second YouTube channel, mostly just for fun, that's called Permaculture Appalachia. And if you look up Permaculture Appalachia on YouTube or whatever, you'll find us. And we just film, you see all this beautiful land behind me that I own. You'll see that, us working on it. We grow elderberries. We have probably at least 100 elderberry trees here, and many other fruit trees, and mostly native herbs and native vegetables and native fruit and mass trees here. So I don't know what's next on that, Daniel. I'm actually injured right now. I hurt my elbow real bad months ago, and it slowed me down. Basically, all I can do now, I'm just picking beans and weeding, and I'm trying to get as much food stored up for winter as I can, and I hope that y'all are too, because if there's any indication what's going on out in the world right now, it's going to be a rough winter. So I hope that y'all are growing food if you're able to. And I hope that if you're not able to grow food, I hope that every time you go to the grocery store, you are buying, get a big bulk sack of rice, get a bulk sack of flour, get some hominy, get some canned goods. Don't go crazy and fill the cart up like people were months ago, but if you go to the store, just grab you some bulk items and put them away and forget about them, because this winter is not going to be fun, y'all. So, but anyhow, Daniel's asking, how did I meet George Gibson? So, like many things, I have my mother to thank for that. My mother, when I was young, she had us living in Florida, and George had retired, and George was living in Florida too, from East Kentucky. And right around the late 90s, when I started playing the banjo, that's when George sort of started to come out into public for the first time. He had never performed on stage before the 1990s, as far as I know. So about 99 or 2000, George put out his masterpiece, National Treasure music album. It's stories and songs and music. And it's called Last Possum Up the Tree. George Gibson's album, Last Possum Up the Tree. It is a national treasure. It's a priceless piece of work that he did there. And at one of the folk festivals down in Florida, either the Florida Folk Festival or the now defunct Florida Old Time Music Championship, at one of those places, she saw his CD on a table of merchandise, and she bought me a copy. And I listened to it one time. This was about 1999 or 2000. I would have been 13, maybe. And I listened to it one time and didn't think anything of it. And I put it away. But the next year when I was 14, for whatever reason, I picked up that album again and listened to it, and it blew me away. Now, Alex Brown's in here. Hey, buddy, how you doing? So I picked it up when I was 14, put it back in the CD player and listened to it. Blew me away, and I had to learn every song on that album. And there was a lot of stuff on that album that I just couldn't figure out. And I knew that I would, if I had to find George, no music had ever spoken to me that way before. No music has ever spoken to me that way before. I think he's the best banjo player alive today, by far. And he's one of the best banjo players that we've ever had in the 200 plus years of our history with this instrument. So I learned a couple of the songs on there, and then on the CD he had contact information. He had his mailing address or something on the damn CD notes. So I sent him a letter with my phone number and my address, and he was just living 2 hours away from me in Florida, and I said that I needed him to teach me what he was doing. And that's how we met. And the first time I ever met George, I was 14 years old. I couldn't even drive myself. My mother had to drive me to his house. And she dropped me off. And I think George and I sat for 8 hours that first day. 8 hours of just passing the banjo back and forth and me trying to absorb everything I could from that man. And so I went back. I would go back and visit him maybe a couple times a year from then on. And once I was old enough to drive myself, when I was 16, I would go visit him more frequently. And usually every time I saw George, we would have an 8-hour conversation. We would sit for 7 or 8 hours and just pass the banjo back and forth between each other. And that's really where I learned most of my basic music chops from, was those early encounters with George Gibson. So if you don't know very much about George, he was born in 1938 in a log house in Knott County, Kentucky. His father was a banjo player. Many of his relatives and neighbors were banjo players. He grew up in the tradition from 1938 in a log home. So that's pretty real. Mike says that Jerron has mentioned that Uncle Dave switched styles in certain songs. I think that's true. Uncle Dave is one of those old pickers who he could pretty much, he played multiple styles, and he kind of went in and out of different styles freely. He did all those tricks and stuff, throwing the banjo and ding, 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 and, all this stuff. So it was nothing for Uncle Dave to switch styles in between. And that may have been something he picked up from vernacular players and from black players, actually. Jim says his buddy Ben Townsend switches pretty regularly. Yeah. Ralph asks, how do you feel about making changes to traditional songs? In your view, how much is too much? Well, for me, I wouldn't alter them very much. That's just me personally. If somebody wants to take an old folk song and alter the hell out of it and make it something completely different, that's up to them. And they can either do a good job of it, or they could do a poor job of it. It could either be tastefully done, or it could be distastefully done. So that's kind of a tricky one. How much is too much? But altering it, just to answer the question, I think that, honestly, every one of us should be altering these songs in some way. The trick is to alter them enough to make it your own, to where you own that music. That's one thing that is disappointing about a lot of old-time musicians, folk musicians. They don't play with conviction or like they own it. Boy. It's like most of us are trying to copy the old greats. Most of us are trying to sound exactly like Kyle Creed, whether we know it or not. And that's that typewriter banjo that I sometimes harp on about. So one thing that I think everybody's tired of seeing is some guy or gal who can perfectly, flawlessly copy Kyle Creed. I think we've all seen enough of that. But what is much more fascinating is if you take a song that Dock Boggs or Kyle Creed or Dink Roberts or John Snipes or any of these old greats did, or George Gibson or Roscoe Holcomb or Lee Sexton, Etta Baker, Elizabeth Cotton, take one of those songs that they did and alter it slightly. Alter it slightly so that you own it, so that you come to a place of comfort in that song. Oh, this other girl just come to say hello. Hey, Maxie. So I think that we should all be altering every single one of these songs slightly, and the trick is to do it with respect to the original tradition. Alter the song as much as you want, but keep it within the original tradition, right? So that's where it gets tricky. We people disagree about how to do that, but if you listen to as much of this music as you can, and more than that, if you read as much as you can about it, and you know, before or after pandemics, if we all survive this pandemic and it blows over, get back out there and get around the oldest people you can find who still play the music, or get around people who have spent time with those people. Then you will develop the cultural literacy and the historical literacy, the background, to be able to alter these songs respectfully within the tradition. That's just my view of it. But I think we should all be altering these songs. So one example I just off the top of my head is Wild Bill Jones. My version of Wild Bill Jones that I two-finger pick in GDG CD, real bluesy sound, is pretty much lifted almost note for note from the version that George Gibson plays. Now, I only ever saw George play that one time. He played it on a 6-string banjo, and he used 3 fingers. So I don't have a 6-string banjo, and I only pick with 2 fingers. So right off the bat, I had to alter that version, right? But then at the end of the song, I've added my own verse. I added a verse that goes, don't you tell my mama about the bad things I've done. Won't you tell her just to pray for me while I'm hanging on the hangman's tree. So that's my verse that I added to the end of Wild Bill Jones. Another verse that I added that I composed to Hills of Mexico is they get in a gunfight. Well, they caught us in an ambush way back in the hills. They was quite a few in number, and the cowboy they did kill. I made a run to save him, but alas, I was too slow. I left him with the outlaws in the hills of Mexico. I made that verse up. And if you ask me, it's a seamless transition from the original 1830s or whatever, that old-ass song, into that verse. So I tried to make it as respectful as I could, but sometimes I just have to add something. I have to make up a new verse. Whoa, Lawson Bowick just come in here. Lawson Bowick's a great banjo player, y'all. You should look up Lawson Bowick. Let's see here. Oh, Lordy. So Daniel responded to my little rant there, and he says, I completely agree. There seems like a strange mismatch between a lot of members of the current traditionalist old-time scene that doesn't match up with the raw individuality of early players like Roscoe, etc. What made those greats great was their unique take on a single body of folk songs. The track listings on the back of the CD might look the same, but they were totally different expressions of art. Yeah, that's true. And you're getting at one of my big hobby horses there, which is the how, all of our current so-called old-time, so-called traditional music, not all of them, but most of it, it's very cookie cutter. It all sounds the same. And all the banjo players, by and large, they're all typists. They're all typewriter banjo players. And that's because they all learned from tablature, or they all learned from the same teachers, And I mean, really, it's like it all goes back to the 1960s at this point. So our current old-time music is really only about as old as 1960, 1965, because that's when all the first banjo tutors, that the tablature, the clawhammer tablature manuals were first composed and published in the 1960s. Before that, clawhammer wasn't even a term for traditional, for overhand down-picking banjo playing. Clawhammer wasn't even used before 1965. That is something that comes out of the urban folk revival out of mostly DC and New York City. And these people came up into the mountains and they started festivals. They learned to play from Tommy and Doc Watson and mostly from Kyle Creed. And then they went back to DC, back to New York, and they wrote tablature books saying, this is how you play old-time banjo. This is the only way to do it. If you're not doing it this way, it's not traditional. And those ideas took hold, and we're still suffering from that mentality today. People think that if you don't learn a song note for note from tablature and you don't play clawhammer, that you're not old-time. And it's nonsense. Well, Alan says, listening to you, your choice of language, you correct a stereotype that Canadians have of this genre of music. Well, Alan, I've run into that stereotype, of course. You know, I don't know exactly what you mean, but I guess thank you for pointing out that I'm articulate. I don't know. And I would caution you never, you know, you wouldn't want to say that to a black American. So Squid says, if clawhammer wasn't used before the 1960s, what was it previously referred to as? Well, that's an interesting question. Most banjo players in the past did not use terminology for how they played. They simply said they played the banjo. But if you want to get into actual terms that were used, one of the most widespread terms was rapping. They said they rapped the banjo. That term was prevalent in both the black and white communities. You could find it as far west as Sand Mountain, Alabama, and as far east as Virginia. People called this the rapping. They rapped the banjo because when you play clawhammer, it's like you're knocking on a door with these fingers. And in the old days, they called that you were rapping on the door. Somebody rapped at the door. So this style, I think probably one of the best describers of it is rapping or rap. And then we get to all say that we're rap musicians. So rapping was very commonly used. The one that was very common in eastern Kentucky was overhand. That's the term that I'm starting to use to get away from clawhammer. I use the term overhand. It is pretty descriptive. It's more descriptive than clawhammer, as you're overhanded. And that's the term that George Gibson is used and pushed. And according to George's research, and I believe it, take him at his word, that was a common term. And he has documentation either before the Civil War or of somebody who's speaking about banjo playing before the Civil War, and they use the term overhand. So overhand is a very early term. It's at least as early as, you know, the 1850s or something. People were calling clawhammer overhand. I mean, another one that was commonly used was just picking the banjo. Like, no matter whether you finger picked or rapped, overhanded it, people called it picking the banjo. I've heard club fisted. I think that was something that come out of people studying black banjo players in North Carolina. The fisted style, or club fisted style. And in the earliest written evidence we have is in these banjo manuals from the 1850s and 1860s, where they call it the stroke style, or they call it the banjo style. I'm fairly certain that those were not terms that were in anybody's vernacular speech. Those are just terms that these musicians made up for their book. So I don't think that stroke style or banjo style are traditional terms. And if you want to talk, we can keep talking about that term clawhammer, where it comes from. It was in use to describe vernacular banjo playing before the 60s, but not overhanded, not downpicking. It was used to describe vernacular three-finger picking. That's actually the earliest reference to clawhammer being used to describe banjo playing, is a reference to three-finger picking. And if you look at this hand, it kind of does resemble a clawhammer. You've got the hammer part here and the claws here. You could see how that could kind of look like a clawhammer. Anyhow, but that is the earliest use. And when it got jumbled up, it's confusing there, but about 1965, the first, what we would think of today as clawhammer, the first clawhammer banjo manual full of tablature and stuff was published, I want to say, in New York City in 1965. And he used the term, erroneously used the term clawhammer to describe that style. Whereas before it had only been used to describe three-finger picking. So there you go. And there's more research on that I can get into, but it basically, it just happened to be a matter of, the wrong word at the right time. So that early banjo tutor got famous and went wild, and it became so popular that they started using, at these early banjo contests in Virginia and North Carolina, not early, but in the 60s, they had a banjo contest. And in the 60s, bluegrass was becoming more popular than the traditional vernacular styles. So they had to separate the banjo contest into a bluegrass banjo contest and a traditional banjo contest. And the traditional banjo contests, at the first one, I forget at which festival this was, but they erroneously called it clawhammer. They said bluegrass and clawhammer. And clawhammer somehow got misconstrued as only meaning this. Anyhow, hopefully the research will be published soon on that. I've read a rough draft of an article that convinced me that that's of the history of that, but it's not published yet, so I don't want to get into too many details, because then I'll get in trouble with the academics even more so than I already am. Oh yeah, Laura says that they called it the knock style. I've heard that. Another very common name for what we call clawhammer today was drop thumb. That was commonly used in Kentucky. They called it drop thumb banjo. But again, I have to stress that the vast majority of traditional banjo players before 1960 did not use any terminology to describe their banjo playing, other than they called it banjo playing. They played the banjo. They didn't concern themselves with this postmodern, modern mind of ours, where everything has to be in its own category and it has to be delineated and limited and regulated and understood. That's sort of a new concept. Old banjo pickers didn't give a damn what they called it. Now they certainly would never think to confine themselves to one style. They didn't think in terms like that. That's why you see people that play all these old field recordings of people with crazy styles. It's because they didn't think in terms of styles. They didn't even have terminology for the styles. This is all new stuff that comes out of academia. It comes out of the urban Northeast, out of the colleges and the universities and the ethnomusicology courses in the 1960s and 70s. It's not vernacular. It's not grassroots. It doesn't come from the working class blacks and whites who actually played this music. The people who built this instrument did not use the term clawhammer. We know that. And in fact, they probably didn't use any terminology at all to describe their playing style. And as you can see, they played the hell out of this instrument. So Leo says, all traditions move on. That's creativity. That's right. That's right, Leo. So Ken asks if I have any recommendations on learning overhand versus two-finger or three-finger for old time. I would love to see more three-finger old-time players. For some reason in the old-time music community, we have an aversion to three-finger picking. If you go to an old-time banjo contest and you lay down the most amazing three-finger old-time banjo tune, depending on the festival, but probably you're gonna get ignored just because you're using three fingers. Most of the people who judge these banjo contests are ignorant and very, very rooted in their ways. And if you don't play clawhammer, they won't even consider judging you. And that is something that we need to, long ago, we needed to rise up and rebel against that. The other thing we need to rise up and rebel against is panels of judges. There should be no panel of judges to determine a guitar contest or a fiddle contest or a banjo contest. In the 19th century, when they were first doing banjo contests, these were often decided by popular vote. You would buy a ticket to see the banjo contest, and with your ticket came a ballot, and you would vote. But when you got your ticket, that gave you the right to vote in the banjo contest. And if you ask me, that's the way it should be done. I think the audience should vote. This new tradition of having a panel of judges, usually they're academics, college-educated people like myself, who sit on a panel and judge musicians, that is something that came out of the 1960s. And I'm almost certain, I can't prove that, but it smacks too much of academia, these like a PhD panel or whatever, an academic panel. They think everything has to be done by a panel of elite educated people. It's nonsense. It's something that's been imposed on our tradition from outside. So I think we should rise up against that. I think banjo contests should be judged by popular vote, and I think that any style should be permitted. If you want to pick bones about if anybody's up there just copying Earl Scruggs, obviously that's not traditional. Copper, honey, quiet. Dog's digging a hole down there. But you should be able to go on there and be judged by the audience, whether you're playing overhand, whether you're down picking, whether you're up picking, whether you're two-finger picking, three-finger picking, four-finger picking, whatever. It should be judged by the audience. We need to throw these judges out. They don't have anything to do with our tradition and our music. Anyhow, I got a little heated over there. But so Ken, my thoughts on that is I would love to see you or anybody else with a mind for traditional music develop their own three-finger style, because we don't have enough three-finger pickers out there. Dock Boggs was a three-finger banjo picker. Charlie Poole was a three-finger picker. George Gibson picks three-finger. I think Lee Sexton picked three-finger or something. I don't know. I'm getting carried away. But which to learn? My answer, Ken, is to learn all three styles at once. Because if you're going to actually be a banjo player for the rest of your life, then eventually you're going to learn all three styles anyhow. So just go ahead and learn them all. I think that... Hey, baby. Oh! I think that the easiest style to learn is two-finger. So if I had to give you some advice to start you out, if I ever start somebody new, a new student who doesn't know anything about music or the banjo, I'll usually start them out as a two-finger banjo player. Excuse me. I think two-finger is much easier than overhand, and I think it's much easier than three-finger. So if you want my advice, I would say start with two-finger. But I started with Scruggs, and then I quit that, and then I started two-finger picking on my own, and then I learned how to do overhand. And so I've been learning overhand and two-fingers simultaneously ever since. Ernie Vega just come in here. I hope everybody will go scroll up and find Ernie Vega's name and click on his profile there. Ernie's putting up a lot of great music. He's a great musician, a great music teacher, and a nice guy. And you should check out Ernie Vega. So Joe says, I've learned a bunch of tunes and techniques from you, and recently also from John Haywood. Good. If y'all are not familiar with John Haywood, look him up. He's actually, I believe he's still operating a private Facebook group where he's giving lessons and stuff. You have to pay to get in the group, but it's probably worth it if you wanna know East Kentucky banjo. John Haywood knows way more than I do. He's actually an East Kentuckian. So I've learned a lot from you and John Haywood. And while you're both George Gibson protégés, you put a really different spin on the way you play. Yeah. That's one thing. You'll notice that anybody who learned their music from George Gibson, no two of us play alike. Because George purposely instills the spirit in his students that you do not copy George, you don't copy other people, you play the banjo, you make it your own. And so all of Gibson's protégés, we all play completely different. Or not completely, but we have different approaches, as Joe is trying to say, if I quit interrupting him. It's nice to have you both to learn from, to be able to see how things can be varied, especially as I'm in the UK, and the only other banjo players I meet play folk punk. Yeah, rather than traditional. Yeah, and he says that most folk punk banjo players aren't exactly learning obscure techniques. No, most folk punk banjo players are just, that I've seen, God bless them, are just strumming, or they learned clawhammer out of a tablature book, and that's what they're doing. So Ken says he had a conversation the other day with someone, and we were trying to distinguish between the knot county lick and a style like round peak. Are we way off in thinking they are similar but come from different geographic regions? Well, of course they're similar. And I've had people have brought that up to me before, that, and it's not accurate for me to call it the knot county lick. It's certainly a technique that probably was very widespread at one time, but historically it's really only mostly found in eastern Kentucky. So you could call it maybe East Kentucky lick. Rufus Crisp had the best name for it. He called it the double shuffle. So I like the double shuffle is good. And then round peak has the same technique, but that's where they're plucking an open string with their left hand that they're not picking with their right. But it's the same, but it's different. I haven't seen anybody, who learned to play, anybody east of Kentucky who employs that technique the way that they do traditionally in Kentucky. In Kentucky, it's employed as a continuous rolling string of open pull-offs. So you get that roll, and it fills in between every sung verse, behind some of the sung verses. You don't see that in round peak picking. Round peak banjo players do it. Real round peak banjo players do use that technique, but not in the same way. They don't just sit there and drone it and zone out on it the way that they did or do in Kentucky. So it is the same, yet different. So Paul says, I'm a big fan of your music. I listen to you on Apple Music every day. I hope the rest of you will too. My question is, what material are you using to fix that banjo head next to you? I don't think I'm going to fix this banjo. Something like this, it's got the original skin head on it. I don't know. To me, it's kind of priceless the way it is. This is for sale, and we're going to sell it as cheap as we can. It's a piece of art to hang on the wall at this point. I could restore this and make it playable, but I don't know. I'm actually torn about what to do with that hide or with this banjo. It would be great to get it up and playing again. You can see it's pretty stable. Maybe I'll do that, but so far I just hate the idea of taking this head off. It may sound a little cheesy, overly dramatic to y'all, but just think about the person who built this instrument. Look at the tool marks. Look at the hard work that went into this, and look at the tradition. It's beautiful. So probably the person who made this, would probably want me to take this head off and put a new head on it and get this instrument playing again. But so far, I have not been able to bring myself to do it. Well, I just realized that this is not the original head. This is a replacement head that got put on over. Can you see this? That's the remnant of the original head, and then over it is this new head. So there's actually, this banjo is actually, I just noticed that for the first time. This banjo has actually been reheaded at least once. And they left the trimmings of the first one on there. That's fascinating. Ow. Sweat bee just bit me. So I don't know what I'm going to do with that. What I want to do is sell it as is, as a piece of folk art. I want to just sell it as is, because I think, me personally, I'd like to leave it that way. I don't know. Daniel Pierce asks, does tablature slow you down in the long run, even though it's tempting to always go to it at first? Yes, Daniel, I would agree with that. Tablature is something that you should try to get away from as soon as possible. I understand people use it and some people require it, and that's fine. I offer tablature on my Patreon now. I have every lesson I've put up this year since January, I put a tablature up with it because it draws more people to me. I'm able to teach more people. I'm able to reach more people with tablature than I am just teaching traditionally, just verbally and visually. So I'll be the first one to admit that tablature is important. It's a tool that I use and will continue to use. But if you want my honest opinion, does tablature, is it going to have a negative effect on you in the long run? Yes. It is a crutch. It's something that you're leaning on. You're relying on that tablature, and it doesn't have to be that way. I'm here to tell you that it's not that complicated. If you try hard enough, year after year, whatever, you can learn the damn thing. You can learn all this music by ear. So I'm not trying to completely trash tablature, but yeah, it limits you, and it's like having an electric tuner. Electric tuner is the same way. A digital electric tuner is a great tool that we can use, but you don't want to be beholden to it. You don't want to rely on that tuner, because someday you're not going to have the tuner. It's just like someday you're going to hear a beautiful piece of music and there's no tablature for it, and you're not going to be able to learn it. You're going to think you're not able to learn it. Same thing with the tuner. You need to be able to tune by ear. And you need to be able to learn and pick up music by ear. Just, for the simple matter of, if you want to play traditional music, that's how traditional music was traditionally played and learned, by ear and by eye. People didn't read tablature. And they didn't use tuners and stuff like that. So I'm not trying to poo-poo it too hard. Go ahead and keep using it. But just be aware that it's a crutch that you're leaning on. And when you lean on a crutch, it has a tendency to weaken you. Just something to think about. So here's a good question. If you were to recommend a few books on traditional banjo music and history in America, what would you recommend? I'm tempted to run back on the bookshelf and grab some to show you, but I won't do that. The first book you need to start with is called Sinful Tunes and Spirituals. Sinful Tunes and Spirituals by Adina Epstein. It's a 1975 or 1977 book. That was the first book that really honestly and accurately tackled the question of where did the early banjo come from, who played it, and how. That's a book called Sinful Tunes and Spirituals by Epstein. So you need that book. That's the place to start. Probably the second book that you need to get is Banjo, Roots, and Branches. That's the sequel to Sinful Tunes and Spirituals. Banjo, Roots, and Branches just came out in 2018. There are several very important articles in that book. I happen to think the most interesting article, and one of the more important articles in the book, is George Gibson's article, which is called Black Banjo, Fiddle, and Dance in Kentucky. So get those two books, Sinful Tunes and Spirituals by Epstein, and Banjo, Roots, and Branches, edited by Bob Winans. Those are two books that you need to get started with. There's many more. African Banjo Echoes in Appalachia by C.C. Conway. That's one that's a little more difficult to read. It's a little bit more holistic and all over the place, but it's a very important book, and you need to read that book too. It's called African Banjo Echoes in Appalachia by Conway. You need to read that. And another one that is important, although it's very expensive, it's at least $90 or $100, is America's Instrument, the banjo in the 19th century. That's by Jim Bowman and Philip Gura. So you need that. There's another book. Laurent Dubois wrote a book that's called, I think it's just called The Banjo. And it focuses on the early banjo in Haiti and Louisiana, which are two regions that we often overlook. Most of us are always focusing on the upper South and Appalachia, southern Appalachia, and the minstrel stuff that happened in New York and Baltimore and D.C. But just as interesting, just as important is the early banjo tradition, or even more interesting in many cases, is the early banjo tradition down in Haiti and in the French-speaking colonies and in Louisiana, early banjo in New Orleans in the early 1800s and stuff. So that book is called The Banjo, and it's by Dubois, D-U-B-O-I-S. You need to look at that at some point. But if you're going to read only one of these books, please read Sinful Tunes and Spirituals. I think that's probably the most important one. So Yuki says, I appreciate your reading recommendations. It's nice to be exposed to resources for historical context. Okay. Brian says, thank you. Thank you, Brian. So Laura says, Pete Seeger is hard to emulate. What was he doing? Well, Pete Seeger was up-picking. A lot of people today still call that up-picking. They still call that Seeger style. So Pete, he played numerous different styles, but the one that he played the most was an up-picking style. It was the same rhythm as what we call clawhammer, but instead of picking down, he was picking up on the melody note. And I have videos on teaching you how to do that. Thank you for the kind words, Jane. So Joe says, everything I learned from tab, I play really rigid and crappy. If I learn by ear organically, I can mess around with it and change it up. It's like it wires my brain up to play it that way only. Tablature will wire your brain to only play it one way. So I stopped using tabs, and then I got way better at the banjo. So Joe has discovered in his journey what many of us I have discovered, and many of you out there either have or are or will discover, which is that tablature is kind of limiting you, and it's not traditional. And I figured this out. The first songs that I learned as a kid, I probably did. Yeah, I learned from tablature originally because I was learning bluegrass stuff out of a book. I don't remember any of that. But the first song that I ever learned by ear was Last Gold Dollar from a recording of George Gibson. It's the first track on his Last Possum Up the Tree album. Well, it's called Last Gold Dollar. There was no tablature for that. I had the tuning in the liner notes, so I tuned my banjo to double C, and I worked it out by ear. It took me all night. This is a true story. I had the banjo muffled and was playing as quietly as I could. My mother woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get ready for work, and I had learned Last Gold Dollar by ear. And I was singing it, and I sat there. I hadn't slept all night. I played the tune and sang it for her, and then I had to go to school without sleeping that day. And I think, unbeknownst to her, I might have actually skipped school that day. That kind of started a bit of a problem with me. When I was between the ages of 14 and 17, I guess I dropped out at 16 or 17, I skipped a lot of school, and I was actually expelled for skipping school so much. And mostly what I was doing was not drinking and smoking weed and masturbating. Mostly what I was doing was picking the banjo. And I would actually prefer to sit at home all day and play the banjo instead of go to high school. So, yeah, and I remember when I first learned that first song by ear, it stuck with me, and I knew it forward and back, like the back of my hand. And immediately, I stopped using I've not used tablature since I was 14 or 15 years old, because that experience taught me the value of learning something organically by ear. Once you learn a song by ear, it's part of you. It's permanent. You will not forget it. If you learn a tune or a song on tablature, it's not really a part of you. It's just something that you're still observing it from the outside. You're not really getting into it. and to be able to do what what the greats do on stage and at square dances and stuff like that, to be able to play, to be a great musician, you have to throw that stuff out, or you have to learn organically with your mind, not by reading shapes on a sheet of paper. But anyhow, I'm driving the point home, I hope. Yeah, Laura says, I think of tab as a tool to use, but not to be dependent upon. That's great, Laura. And the more and more that you can liberate yourself from any form of dependency on tablature, the better. Get away from it if you can. Jim, if you're interested in this banjo, in the condition that it's in as a piece of art, it's a very rare piece of art, and I would have to mail it to you. Oh, $350. I'd probably sell it for $350. Because it cost me $50 to ship it. And then I have to, I don't own any of these. I don't own this banjo. I'm selling it for a friend, so I have to pay my friend, and then I have to take a cut myself. So $350 is probably about as low as we'd be willing to go on this. It's a rare piece of art. I have a YouTube video that'll be coming out soon if you want to look at it more closely. So there's no rush, and if nobody wants it, my friend is happy to hang it up on his wall. He has a lot of instruments hanging on his wall, and he'd like to sell this one. So $350 if anybody would like it. I'd probably sell it for $350. Oh, Drew's got a whopper of a question. Do you think the 1960s folk revival, introducing traditional Southern music to a wider audience, has ultimately been a positive force in dispelling negative stereotypes about the banjo and Appalachia in general and increasing people's appreciation of these traditions? Or would you rather it have remained an underground sort of thing? Despite having family members from Southern Appalachia who played banjo music, I don't think I would have initially gotten into this music without the more modern interpretations of it and the, quote, jam sessions, which I now find myself steering away from and playing on my own and learning by attempting to emulate old recordings. That's a damn tough question, Drew. That is a damn tough question. I'm very conflicted about it. Because like you know, I had vernacular musicians in my family, but they were all dead by the time I came along. I don't know of any banjo players in my family, but there was a big old branch of my family in northern Alabama, and at least two of them were fiddle players that I've been told, and I think one of them was a fiddle maker too. So, but I never would have had anything to do with this music if it had not been for the Florida Folk Festival and the Florida Old Time Music Championship. It would have been much more difficult for me to get into it, because I got into bluegrass picking. I wanted to play the banjo, but I had no idea that there was any other way to play the banjo. And I was so ignorant when I was 13 years old, I thought the banjo came from Ireland. That's what older people around me would say. They said that it came from Ireland. Which is crazy. So without the folk revival, without all these urban academics coming up into the mountains and co-opting and corrupting and bastardizing these traditions the way they have, and monetizing it and writing books about it and building their careers on it, often with erroneous information and erroneous, often racist, almost always classist assumptions and ideology that clouds their judgment on these things. So all those negative things aside, if they hadn't done that, yeah, I wouldn't have anywhere near the amount of material to work with that I do now. These were the people who went up into the mountains and recorded people. My own father was a kid in Washington, D.C. in the 1950s and 60s, early 60s, late 50s. And he made trips up into from D.C. up into the mountains with tape recorders with friends, and they recorded people playing banjo, fiddle, harmonica, guitar. My dad claims they actually sold some of their recordings to Alan Lomax. So some of those recordings are somewhere in an archive somewhere, and they may be released one day with Alan's name on them. So my own father was part of the folk revival, you know, and I think it's great. A lot of great music came out of the folk revival, a lot of great thinking, a lot of great people. So that's one thing I don't want to convey, this feeling that I just hate it and want to tear it all down. You know, I'm just trying to approach the subject honestly, warts and all, like I try to do with everything. So, and to be honest, while there's a lot of great things about this, the folk revival, we're in a folk revival right now. There's a lot of great things about it. There's a lot of bad things about it. And, you know, I'd like to think that my everyday activities are sort of a testament to the good things about it. Woo. But that was a very interesting question, Drew, and I'm conflicted. So Laura asks if Pete was carrying on the advancement of a personal technique. Not necessarily. Pete learned that technique, you know, from vernacular players, as far as I know. I mean, Pete went up into the, I believe, into the mountains and learned that up-picking style from people. And he called it frailing. And unfortunately, Pete is now dead. We don't know where the term frailing comes from. The earliest reference to frailing that you'll find is an advertisement about Cousin Emmy. Cousin Emmy was a female banjo performer from Eastern Kentucky, I believe. She's from Kentucky somewhere. A lot of people don't know this, but Cousin Emmy taught Grandpa Jones how to play the banjo. Grandpa Jones didn't know a damn thing about the banjo until he met Cousin Emmy. And Cousin Emmy taught him to play the banjo. But yet, you know, he's considered, anyhow, I just think that's interesting. Grandpa Jones learned banjo from Cousin Emmy. They're both from Kentucky. But there's an advertisement that was describing Cousin Emmy's, the way she played music and stuff, and it said that she had a wild flailing way of playing the banjo. She flailed it. It was a flailing. She flailed it. And flail is an actual word. It's an actual English word. People used to go, flail just means to beat something. They used to go out with these, a flail is actually two sticks tied together in the middle or chained together in the middle that the old timers back in Europe would use to beat the grain out of stalks of wheat and stuff. They would flail the wheat. And so they said that Cousin Emmy's style of playing was like a flail. And that's probably where the term frailing comes from. I don't know how, but as far as I know, Pete Seeger is the earliest use of the term frailing to describe banjo playing. Now, Art Rosenbaum has told me that he met an old-timer who was either contemporaneous or slightly before Pete got famous, and Art Rosenbaum told me that old-timer used the term frailing. So I could be wrong. It could be an old term, but we haven't found it documented anywhere else. And really very interesting to note, George Gibson, who grew up in a relatively strong vernacular, relatively isolated vernacular banjo playing tradition in eastern Kentucky in the 1940s, 1950s, he never heard the term frailing until he started interacting with folk revival banjo players. So I don't know. I'm not sure about the term frailing. But was Pete carrying on the advancement of a personal technique? Not when he was playing the up-picking style. That's a traditional style. But Pete's other styles, I think every other way Pete played was just stuff that he kind of made up. I'm not sure. I don't know as much about Pete Seeger as I ought to. Oh, and Laura asks, what is Zack Sokolow doing, or Sokolow? Zack, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. The last name S-O-K-O-L-O, Sokolow. Shitfire. There's a good banjo player, really good banjo player called Zack Sokolow. You can look him up on YouTube. He's a little more active now since the pandemic. He does real nice videos with pretty backdrops usually, and he's a great banjo player. So what is Zack doing? I think he's mostly a three-finger banjo picker. You usually see him, he likes to wear three-finger picks on his fingers. So I want to say I don't know. But, and then people who I've asked, I asked Jerron Paxton, I think, about Zack and said, what the hell, where did he learn to play? And I want to say that Jerron told me that he knew Zack. He's known Zack for years since they were both kids in California. And I believe he told me that Zack has always played that way. So I don't know if that's true. I don't want to speak for the guy, but so if you ask me, that is, and it's not just a three-finger style because it's almost like a three-finger up-picking style because he doesn't keep fingers rested on the head. It's like all of his fingers are moving. It's an unusual style, and I'd like to see more like that. Look up Zack Sokolow on YouTube. Oh, Bucky Anderson just come in here a minute ago. Hey, Bucky. Bucky's another great banjo player from down here in Georgia. I haven't seen Bucky in years. So Dana asks me if I'm kin to the Watauga County Hickses. Not that I know of, Dana. We may be distantly related, but we're not closely related. And the way that I know that is because I know my Hicks ancestors came from Yorkshire, England in the 1700s, I think the early 1700s. And they landed at Philadelphia, and then they made their way into the Pennsylvania mountains. And those Hicks relatives, they stayed in those Pennsylvania mountains until the Civil War. I don't think any of them ever saw the South until they unfortunately joined the U.S. Army and marched south to fight in the Civil War. So my direct line ancestors actually come from the Pennsylvania mountains. So we are mountaineers. It is an Appalachian family, but it's northern Appalachia up in the Pennsylvania mountains where there really was no banjo tradition to speak of. So if I am related to people like Stanley Hicks and D. Hicks and those people, if I am related to them, it's very distant because we know that their ancestors, although they also came from England about the same time as mine, they probably came from Yorkshire. Most Hickses in England in the 1700s lived in Yorkshire. So they probably came from Yorkshire about the same time for the same reasons and were probably some of the same sort of people. And they probably shared a lot of musical traditions when they first got here. But those Hickses down in that are in North Carolina and East Tennessee today, their ancestors all settled in Virginia first. So instead of coming into Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, their ancestors came into Virginia, probably in through the Chesapeake Bay in the 1700s, which is how a lot of other people came in. So we're not related. I don't think any of our kin has mixed or been intermarried or reproduced with one another since before the 1700s. So yeah, I probably am very, very distantly related, but I'm not part of that family. And I have met some of those people and been welcomed by them like I was family. But I'm not blood related very closely to them. Thanks for that question, Dana. I like to answer that question and clarify that because a lot of people assume that because I'm an Anglo Southern banjo player named Hicks, people assume that I'm related to all them, descended from them, but I'm really not. Oh, Bob has a good question. He says, do you know of any two-finger picking style where you up-pick and down-pick with your index finger and use the other fingers to hit the head for rhythm? Yeah. That is how, if you look up how I play Little Birdie, that's how I learned to play Little Birdie. That's this, he's talking about, it's a two-finger up-picking style. And a lot of old-timers, especially in East Kentucky, they would use that style to play Little Birdie. Even if they always played overhand or finger-picked, when they played Little Birdie, they would wrap the head with their three fingers, and you're brushing down and picking up. You pick up on the individual note and brush down from the bass to the first. So you're picking up, brushing down, tapping, and plucking with the thumb. So you're getting this. If I had a banjo to demonstrate, I would. But yeah, Bob, what you need to do, I hate to refer you to, you got to look up my video, but go on YouTube and look up Clifton Hicks, Little Birdie, and you'll see me, and there's several versions where I'm doing it, but look for the one where I'm tapping my fingers like this, and I believe I'm using that exact style that you're describing. And I don't know what to, there's not a name for that. I'm tempted to call it the Little Birdie style because I do know that a lot of, like I said, a lot of East Kentucky old-timers, they all use that, a lot of them use that style when they played Little Birdie, which tells me that it must have been an archaic dance style that fell out of fashion except for that tune. It's clearly a dance style. It's a rhythmic dance style. So Doug asks, was the banjo the original blues instrument, i.e. before the guitar? You could say that. The original blues instrument is the human throat, the lungs and the voice and the heart, obviously. And the implement, the hoe or the hammer or the axe, that provided some of that rhythm to the early music, I think. So the original blues instrument is just the human voice and maybe a hoe. But what was the next one? Probably a drum. After that, yes, probably a banjo. But did the banjo predate the guitar as the preeminent blues instrument? Yes, most certainly. And if you read that book that I recommended earlier by Dina Epstein, 1970s book called Sinful Tunes and Spirituals, if you read that book cover to cover, you will probably come away from that agreeing with me. Blues is much older than the 1900s. It's much older than the 1800s. And it is probably older than the banjo, but it's at least as old as the banjo. Woo! Well, my voice is getting a little hoarse, everybody, and I think I'm going to end it there. I see some more comments. I'm sorry that I can't get to them, but if everybody could give this a thumbs up, if you want to help me, give this a thumbs up. If you want to really help me, share this this video. I'm trying to draw as much attention to this material as I can. Of course, to line my own pockets, but also because I want to get the truth out there, and I want to get the information out there. I want people to play better music. So thank you all for watching. I'm going to sign off, and I'm going to probably eat some more watermelon and drink some damn water. Y'all be out there, and I hope that your families are doing fine. Hope everybody's okay. And like I did say earlier, I hope that you're growing food. And if you're not able to grow the store, just every time you go to the store, pick up a big sack of rice, pick up a big sack of dried beans, and just put it away. I think that might be, you might be glad you did that later this winter, because things are not gonna. I don't expect that everything's gonna break down and we're all gonna be sick and dying. But you are not going to want to go to the grocery store this winter. You're just not going to want to go. So now's the time to start stocking up on your dried goods and your cans, your sacks of rice. Hominy, if you want to get healthy corn, hominy is way more nutritious than cornmeal and just sweet corn in a can. So get you some dried hominy or some canned hominy. Get you some big sacks of rice and some big sacks of beans, and just forget about them. Put them away for the winter. Okay, everybody, that's all I'm going to say. Thanks for looking. Y'all take care. I'm going to try to figure out how to turn this thing